This slide shows you a few of the course abbreviations we'll be using. Some are used throughout psychology, whereas others we're just going to use in this particular course. Psychology symbol, the psi, the first one. I've introduced my interest psychology students. It'll be useful for us too. It's much shorter than the word psychology, obviously, or much shorter than even PSYCH. Next, we're going to use MI as abbreviation for mental illness. That's more or less specific to this course, as we'll use D for disorder. RX for treatment is a standardized symbol. Next time you get a prescription, if it's a paper prescription, look on the pad and you will see RX for treatment. And we'll be using SJS for subjects. It's, again, course specific. If you use these, it'll help you keep up with your peers as you take notes or as you take notes on the slides if you're doing this course separately online. The focus of abnormal psychology are the mental disorders, but the term mental disorder can be said in various ways. Mental disorder is obviously acceptable. It can be used interchangeably with mental illness. It can also be used interchangeably with psychological disorders, or it can be used interchangeably with psychological illness. So no one is necessarily strongly preferred over the others. Certain authors or teachers or will prefer one or the other, but still treat them all interchangeably. Since the focus of our course is abnormal psychology, it's essential that we learn the definition. I have blanks in the definition, so I'd like you to try to determine on your own, if you can, what should go in there. We'll define it as the branch of psychology which attempts to something, something, and something, something in the topic of the blank blanks. For a hint, you can see that the first 4 blanks should be the goals of psychology, and the last 2, the focus of our course. The first blank, be on the D, if that's a help. Is it define, determine, describe? Hopefully you're going to go with the word describe. Second one could be explain or understand. Third one, predict or prediction. And the fourth one, control, change, modify, help. And the last 2, well, mental disorders, mental illnesses, psychological disorders, or psychological illnesses. If you're trying to figure out the noise, that's Bailey, my foster dog. You come to visit. He says hello. As you read the definition for a psychological disorder, try to fill in the 3 blanks. Given the previous slide, I think it'll be pretty easy for you to do. But as you consider the definition, focus on the term health condition. Many people, of course, including students, think of psychological disorders as one category in their mind and physical conditions another category. And I would urge you, for the good of yourself and society and your family, put them all in one big category. So virtually every psychological condition has physical components and vice versa. So maybe you would have in the past said, oh, physical conditions, diabetes, heart disease, psychological conditions, anxiety disorders, mood disorders. Instead, place them in one big category. This will help to remove the stigma that's in the previous generations associated with mental health conditions. If a person is willing to admit that they have a mental health condition, they're more likely to get it treated, which will have a profoundly positive effect on them and all the media people around them, and even greater society. So again, focus on the term health condition. In terms of the blanks, I assume that you're very tempted correctly to say think, or a good synonym such as cognition, act, or a good synonym such as react or behave, and feel or emotions is the last one. Let's consider the indicators of abnormality, the 4 Ds. First one is danger. That would refer to danger to self as well as others. That being said, it is a misconception that mentally ill people as a group are dangerous. Most crimes are committed by people that are legally sane. Statistics clearly show us that the mentally ill person is not more likely to commit violent crimes. They are much more likely to be a victim of crime, but again, they're actually less likely to be the committer of a violent crime. Deviance, that refers to violation of social norms. Distress, it refers to personal distress. Feeling bad, feeling negative emotions, suffering. Dysfunction, inability to meet life's basic demands of self-care, of working, of maybe going to school, of taking care of the others in your life, such as children or elderly adults. So inability to meet the daily demands that we all face. So consider the women shown in these slides. The neck stretching rings, which actually don't affect the neck but really push down the shoulders, or the bound feet of China. These behaviors have to be regarded in the social context, so if this person is living in their culture, it would not be considered to be abnormality. Choosing these behaviors while living in America would, in contrast, definitely be a deviation from social norms. Throughout the bulk of human history, humans explain mental illness and even most physical illnesses in terms of demonological model, that is, being caused by supernatural forces. And it would make sense then if you thought that the supernatural would be the cause of physical and mental disorders, then it would have to be central to the treatment of physical and mental disorders. So if that makes sense, let's look at a few of the treatments associated with the demonological model. This is an example of a skull that's been trephined. You can see the word trephine or trephinization or trephining. It refers not to the drilling, but rather the cutting of a hole in the skull, presumably to release the supernatural forces. This person had the jackpot, if you'll see in the frontal facing skull, 2 holes, and the backward facing one. If you look closely, you'll see at least 5 holes. Did people survive this procedure? Definitely. People who know bones can look at the edge of that bone and tell whether the person survived or not based on some signs of healing, and indeed, this was very much a survivable procedure. Many students get confused and think the brain is being touched. The brain is not being touched. Underneath the skull would be the protection for the brain. Do you remember the name of the protection? Think about it for a moment. Was it blood-brain barrier? Was it myelin? Was it meninges? It was the meninges. So the scalp would be cut, the piece of skull would be removed, who knows what they would do with it, the person would be sutured back up. All done, of course, without local anesthesia because this is ancient times. A slight bump in the head with the skull missing would be lethal. Did this cure mental illness? Presumably not. It would be a fair assumption to say that not only they had whatever mental illness they originally had, presumably schizophrenia, but on top of that, they would almost always, I would assume, have a good case of PTSD. One might wonder, well, why can't the supernatural forces exit the same way they entered? My answer is, perhaps, think of a lobster trap. The lobster can get in, but it can't get out. So maybe these holes, these exits, you want to be fancy, these egresses were made to facilitate the leaving of the mental illness causing spirit. Now if you would go back to our previous slide so we can consider the more modern technique of lobotomy. The 2 major treatments associated with the demonological model would be exorcism and trephining. Now, exorcism would vary quite a bit from culture to culture, from time period to time period, but exorcism always involved rituals designed to drive out the supernatural forces. If you were lucky, it might be praying and chanting, certainly would do you no harm and quite possibly some good. But in other societies, it might be submersion in cold water, forcing the person to have emetics, things that would cause them to vomit, any binding, anything that would make the physical body so terribly uncomfortable that the spirits would be motivated to leave. So it could be very akin to torture in some circumstances. Do societies still engage in exorcism? Absolutely, positively. Even, for example, the Catholic Church, on very special occasions, will receive a discompensation to allow its use. So your HMO will not pay for it, but it's a part of many, many cultures and many people's belief systems, even to this day. So let's consider the contribution to Hippocrates to abnormal psychology. Time period about 460 to almost 400 before the present. No, you do not need to know that date. Just wanted to give you a kind of a picture of time period. I often ask my students in terms of background information, what do you know about Hippocrates? So take a moment, and do you have any associations with Hippocrates? Some students say Hippocratic Oath, excellent, or oh, don't be a hypocrite, often also excellent. And he's often considered to be the father of Western medicine anyway. Now, in terms of his view of mental illness, a rather modern view in some ways. He thought that illnesses had both a physical and psychological component. For example, in some situations, he would prescribe for the person to get away from their family, recognize for some people the family could be a contributor. So again, seeing mental illnesses having physical and psychological components. So now let's consider a time period which goes by many names: medieval times, dark ages, middle ages. During this time period, Rome and the rest of Europe fell into an economic, intellectual, and cultural decline. Fear and suspicion and ignorance became the rule. This lasted from about 5th to 14th centuries, almost 1,000 years, and no, you don't need to study that date for me. So where do we stand in terms of their view of mental illness? Well, far from being the way Hippocrates viewed it, we slid back into a firm belief of the demonological model. So all the gains that had been incurred in thinking were lost. So as we saw on the previous slide, the Middle Ages, Dark Ages / medieval time period ended with the arrival of the Renaissance. Renaissance, 13th to 17th century, and again, no, you don't need to know those dates for me. Perhaps for your history teacher, but not for me. So this is a time that we came back into more modern thinking, great advances in art, building construction, medicine somewhat, moving forward. And yet, we did not see, in many ways, this carry over into the treatment of the mentally ill. So this was a time period of both forward thinking and in both Europe and America, fear of witches and witchcraft and the persecution of witches and witchcraft. On the next slide, we'll see how this relates to our course. So let's compare witches and witchcraft in Europe versus the colonies. In the colonies, 19 people were killed, and You might assume that they were burned. Thank goodness, no, they were hung. Estimates for approximately 100,000 men, women, and children were killed with the charge of witchcraft. Who were the identity? Quite variable. Some were women that had power, so women in power were not acceptable by the establishment. This was a good time to eliminate them. It could be somebody who just had something you wanted. Maybe there was a good pond on their land. If they were out of the picture, you would have that pond for your livestock. It could be just people that were rude or offensive, but particularly, and related to this course, people that were mentally ill. So many people that behaved bizarrely, particularly people with schizophrenia, were much more likely to be charged and perhaps executed as witches. So in this time period, even though it was the Renaissance, extraordinarily backwards. Yet at the same time, asylums were starting to be built in the European era, and these asylums were originally just buildings that were left over. Vacant buildings, for example, leprosariums, old leper buildings that no one else wanted to use. And these empty buildings became a place where we could store the mentally ill away from society. Visit the link and you'll see asylums in America, what they look like now. These would be the old abandoned ones. I picked out this particular source, very chilling, and I will show you a few other pictures later on in this chapter of it. So do take a visit to this link. Let's now consider the reform movement for abnormal psychology. Time period, think of the time period roughly around the time of the Revolutionary War in our country, in the time period leading up to it. So about the 1770s through just getting into the very, very early 1900s. During this time period, instead of the traditional inhumane treatment that had been the norm, the focus was now something called moral treatment and moral therapy. At the heart of this moral therapy was the humane treatment of the mentally ill. It flourished until the late 1800s, at which point it started to rapidly decline. Why the decline? In part due to lack of money, which caused the wonderful facilities that were built to become neglected and overcrowded. And staffing became very poor quality and often abusive. Another reason for the decline was the dislike of the mentally ill. Many of them were immigrants suffering from the extreme hardships of leaving their own country and their maltreatment in the U.S. So due to prejudice against immigrants and the perception that the mentally ill were dangerous, and as we will learn in this course, an incorrect presumption. We'll look at some of the key players in the subsequent slides. They include the reformers of Italy, France, England, and 3 American reformers. The picture that you will see on this slide or the next slide was for the state lunatic asylum in Utica, and that was the correct terminology of the day and time. They would have sometimes dances for the peoples at the institutions, and they were often termed lunatic balls. So again, obviously reflecting a terminology not acceptable to us, but acceptable back then. Let's start with the reformer of Italy, Vincenzo Chirughi, who had a very odd combination of both barbaric treatment and moral therapy. His humane practices, including allowing the patients to bathe and encouraging bathing and hygiene, separation of men and women to protect the women from sexual assault, gave access to the grounds, had exercise. Now, in terms of details about his particular experiences, He was the director of the Bonifacio, if I'm saying it correctly, hospital in the 1780s in Italy. If you just know that he was a director of a hospital, that's more than enough to keep your teacher happy. What about some of the barbaric practices that would not be considered to be moral therapy? Using heat to blister patients, purging, in other words, causing forced vomiting, bleeding, a popular and sometimes lethal therapy of the day, cold, icy water baths, dunking people, so fear of drowning is while they're also being exposed to the cold water. And he also believed in whipping his arrogant patients. So again, a very odd blend of moral treatment and barbarism. When I Googled Jean-Baptiste Poussin, this is what came up. Somehow I don't think this is necessarily the image for our class. Poussin was one of the two great French reformers. He worked with Pinel and actually was one of the two founders of the moral therapy movement. He was the superintendent of a particular hospital in France, the mental ward that is, of La Victoire. And we should know that he was a superintendent, meaning that he was in charge of the day-to-day runnings of this particular institution. In this famous painting, it showed Philip Pinel unchaining the patients, which is definitely a bit of artistic liberty, since it was not Pinel that did this, but Jean-Baptiste Poussin, who we learned about on the previous slide. Even back then, there was a little bit of fake news. Of all the reformers, both American and European, Philippe Pinel is by far to be considered the most important. He was drawn to this area due to a friend's suicide. He wrote very influential texts, and you don't need to know the name of it, but I would like you to know he wrote a very influential text. He worked with Poussin at La Victoire, that we mentioned before. He had daily conversation with his patients and created case studies. Again, he was using the scientific method. And for these reasons and more, he was considered to be the most important of all the reformers. Let's next consider Samuel Tuke, the great reformer of England. He was a Quaker abolitionist. He became drawn to the area when visiting a local mental institution. He saw female patients naked chained to the walls. He was motivated to secure funding and build his own institution, pictured on the slide, on 11 acres. The buildings themselves were spacious and airy. He abandoned the current practice of bleeding patients in favor of giving warm baths, and he encouraged the individuals institutionalized to fill their activities with productive labor, such as sewing or knitting. So certainly a drastic improvement from the prevailing facilities of that day and age. Let's next consider the American reformers, starting with Benjamin Rush. Perhaps if you take American history, his name will come up. He was one of the founding fathers, being both a member of the Continental Congress and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a Surgeon General for the U.S. as well as a U.S. Treasurer. He founded Dickinson College, if you're familiar with it, and I don't know if this is good or bad for you people who have taken chemistry. He wrote the first American chemistry textbook ever. He was also an abolitionist and had other bizarre ideas. Not only was he an abolitionist, if you want to believe it, he believed in the education of women. He also believed in free medical clinics for the poor, so basically socialized medicine. Unfortunately, as a doctor, he thought bleeding was helpful for just about every condition. The next American that we'll consider will be Dorothea Dix. She was a Boston school teacher, and she wanted to help the mentally ill. She went to prisons to read Bible to them, but she found that the Bible was the least of their needs. She was horrified by the conditions that she saw. So she traveled from state to state, seeing the conditions firsthand, and also lobbying the state legislatures and Congress for funds. She spent over 40 years of her life. Remember, back then, the average person died at age 50, by the way. So she spent 40 years of her life from about 1841 to 1881 fundraising and lobbying. The funds directly contributed to the building of 32 mental institutions, which were state-of-the-art. And also from her work, each state was charged to build public hospitals for the mentally ill. The last American that we'll consider will be Clifford Beers, quite different from all the other reformers. He himself suffered from mental illness, and he and his 5 siblings all died in mental hospitals. He wrote a very influential book about his experiences, A Mind That Found Itself, published in 1907. He was forced to sleep in a straitjacket so tightened that it cut off the circulation of his hands. He spent days in bare, unheated cells, clothed in only underwear, and commonly witnessed the beating of patients, in his own words, so far out of their minds that they could not comprehend or obey orders. And so through his book, people learned of the experiences, felt great sympathy, and he had a significant impact in the treatment of mentally ill in our country and how they were regarded in this country. Let's now consider some of the many advances in the care and treatment of the mentally ill from about the mid-1800s until the present. Let's consider the concept of warehousing. Before we had effective treatments for mental illness, if you suffered from a severe mental illness, you were put into an asylum or other institution, and you often spent your entire life there. You would typically be abandoned by your family. You would typically die there and be buried on the grounds, so no escape, even in death. When did this end? Well, when we saw the advent of effective psychiatric drugs. The lobotomy was a technique, and we'll discuss in a few slides below. I should mention that one of the promoters of lobotomy, Egas Moniz, he was Portuguese, received the Nobel Prize for his particular use of the procedure, as well as being shot by one of his patients, resulting in paralysis. You might call that a mixed review. ECT, we'll be discussing this in a slide or two. Neurotransmitters, we had a vast increase in neurotransmitters leading up to the introduction of psychiatric drugs beginning 1950 and the few years beyond it. So now, for the first time, we were having effective treatments for depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Deinstitutionalization refers to the mass release of the mentally ill from institutions due to the effectiveness of psychiatric drugs, and many of these individuals had been institutionalized for years or decades. And this began starting in about the mid-1950s. Next thing we should consider was something called the Community Mental Health Center Act that was in 1963. It mandated all states and major cities to make provision for the mentally ill that were now deinstitutionalized, providing outpatient services, as well as other people in the community that would need these same mental health services. So you might notice a considerable lag between deinstitutionalization, mid-50s, and this act, 1963. In terms of technologies, we'll talk about such things as EEG, VNS, DBS, TMS, Next, we'll consider the fact that big business HMOs now exert considerable control over therapy. And this became problematic because they decided that there should be a difference in funding between psychological illness and mental illness. This differential treatment was outlawed in 2018 in a group of laws called the parity laws, which mandated that equal spending should be for both physical and mental illness. So if your plan had so many days for a physical illness of hospitalization, it had to be same for mental illness. If you could spend this much on drugs for a physical illness, they had to spend the same amount for drugs for a psychological illness. But even then, since then, there have been many lawsuits where HMOs were not providing the parity that was required by law. So the lobotomy was a procedure that was slowly phased out with the advent of psychiatric drugs. So it wasn't a one day doing it and one day not doing it, but it slowly phased out, getting to the point that lobotomies are no longer done. In fact, the last lobotomy is done in the 1960s. Are you aware of any famous movies on the topic of lobotomy? The next slide will give you an answer. Yahya Moniz received for his lobotomy procedure both the Nobel Prize and being shot by one of his rather unhappy patients, resulting in paralysis. Definitely a mixed review. The picture below is that of the celebrated neurologist and lobotomy zealot, Walter Friedman. Now, from its advent, about 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the U.S. 3,500 of them were performed by Walter Friedman, the so-called ice pick lobotomy. Friedman, as I mentioned, very zealous in his dedication to the technique, performed as many as 20 per day. Now, the last lobotomy in the U.S. was performed in 1967 by Friedman. The patient died on the table, and as a result, he did lose his medical license. But that was not the first death that Friedman experienced. 490 of his patients also died, approximately 1 in 15. Most did survive, though, but at best, he indicated they lost the sparkle, aspects of their personality, zest. More catastrophic outcomes also occurred, such as severe intellectual loss, paralysis, epilepsy, inability to control one's bowel or bladder. So thank goodness the procedure was phased out, but again, not by any action done by, at least any intentional action done by Friedman. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with a very young Jack Nicholson was focused on the topic of lobotomy. Let's now consider ECT. First, take a moment and see if you can think what each, or guess what each letter stands for, and whether or not it's still used. And thirdly, and lastly, what condition is it most likely to be used to treat? So again, what do the letters stand for? What is it used to treat? And is it still used currently? So ECT stands for electroconvulsive, make sure there's a V in there, electroconvulsive therapy. It's primarily used to treat major depression, though is sometimes used to treat bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. It is still used. and it's still considered to be the best choice for major depression, which proves to be highly resistant to any other form of treatment. Under those conditions, where virtually every therapy has been tried unsuccessfully, ECT will work in about 80% of the cases. It's not given in one treatment, it's given in a series of usually 6 to 9 times over a period of weeks. And it, again, usually is effective. Nowadays, it's performed differently than the past. The person is anesthetized. Typically, it's performed unilaterally, that is only in one hemisphere. It was first discovered, if you will, by Italian Ugo Cerletti in 1937. And next, if you could go into the link, you'll see a little bit more information on modern ECT. Let's now consider the two major 20th century approaches to the understanding and treatment of mental illness. Again, remembering that the bulk of human history, the demonological, was the preferred and virtually only model. First, let's consider psychogenic perspective and then somatogenic. The psychogenic, and make sure you don't put genetic by accident if you're asked to provide the term psychogenic, the viewpoint that mental illness is caused by psychological factors such as stressors. Championed by Mesmer, who mesmerized audiences for both entertainment and a little bit of treatment applications, but primarily he was an entertainer. He wore a flowing purple cape, and he had a purple turban, and he had a mystical rod, and he would entertain the rich and or nobility of his day and age. In Intro Psych, I mentioned that the King of France could not decide whether Mesmer was a scientist or a charlatan. He charged not one, but 2 different commissions to investigate him, one headed by Benjamin Franklin, who concluded that he was a charlatan and fraud, amongst other things. But after Mesmer's death, different physicians started to look at the possible use for treatment of mental illness. 2 physicians whose names you do not need to know, members of the Nancy School, named after the town Nancy in France, used it to treat mental illness. They also showed that it could produce mental illness-like symptoms. Next, Breuer, whose name you might not know, Joseph Breuer, worked with Freud, and indeed, Freud's famous patient, Anne O, Freud never treated. Freud was actually working with the notes and the help of Joseph Breuer in describing with Anna O. Next, let's consider the somatogenic, and be careful, not genetic, but genic perspective. Many texts and teachers prefer the term biogenic, but your textbook prefers somatogenic. Now, if you had me for intro psych, you probably learned that the cell body of a neuron is called the soma. So if you remember soma means body, then somatogenic would be, somatogenic would refer to body. So in this approach, there's an emphasis on the physical causes of mental illness. It was championed by Emil Kraepelin, who wrote the first classification system for mental illness. If you spell classification with a K, it might help you to remember that's associated with Kraepelin. It was also championed by von Krafft-Ebing, and he showed that mental illness, in the case of the condition of genital paresis, had a physical cause, that of syphilis. So here was the first evidence ever that a mental illness could be caused by a physical disease. In chapter 1 of your textbook, your 2 authors, that of Ronald and Jonathan Comer, introduce you to the major modern mental health professionals. We have the psychiatrists who are medical doctors and have an MD. They went to medical school, and after the 4 years of medical school, specialized in psychiatry. The average amount of time it would take to be fully trained as a psychiatrist would be 11 to 13 years. For all these professionals, I will give you the amount of average time it takes. I will not ask you to know that for any sort of tests, so I'm just providing in case you're thinking about these as career options. We also have clinical psychologists. That person would be in the psychology concentration at this college. They would be a psychology major when they go to a 4-year institution. And after they graduate from their 4-year college, it'll take them another 4 to 8 years of higher education. Again, so that's a total of 8 to 12 years. Counselors, where there's different types and different degrees, but this person would typically have a master's degree, often in counseling psychology. The average amount of time it would take them, including their undergraduate time period, assuming they completed in 4 years, would be 6 to 9 years. Lastly, we'll consider the social worker. The social worker could start easily at SCCC and be in the Human Services program. They would then transfer to a 4-year college and they would get their bachelor's degree in social work. But at that level, you're not able to do mental health care yet. They would then get their master's degree and they would have an MSW in psychology. And at that point, they could indeed work in a private practice or a government facility doing counseling. The average amount of time that would take a social worker would be 6 years. In terms of the rarest, it would be the psychiatrist. In terms of the most common mental health professional, it would be the social worker. Let's consider the two modern options to the treatment of mental illness. Both your HMO would be happy to pay for. One would be psychotherapy, in other words, talk therapy. The other would be all the medically based treatments. For most mental illnesses, a plan using both works best.